42 million Americans are currently caring for aging family members. All this week, we'll be introducing you to local families facing challenges from choosing the right care to managing finances. Tonight, we look at the toll that caring for elderly parents can take. WGBH News reporter Gail Huff has more.
All right, let's go down right here.
EVELYN ROSSIN is excited to pick up her 85-year-old mother and spend time with her. Today, the two Evelyns are going out for ice cream.
Let me get your walker out.
This light-hearted day is a far cry from the stressful days they used to share when they lived together. EVELYN was the primary caregiver for both her parents, who lived in her house during the past 15 years. Her father was first to get sick with colon cancer and then dementia.
It can be so consuming. My father had many illnesses that were quite serious, that were life-threatening illnesses. And I was bringing up a family at the same time.
He died 4 years ago, but a short time later, her mother developed a tumor on her neck and was diagnosed with lymphoma. EVELYN took care of her at home, too, throughout the chemotherapy and treatments.
The overwhelming sense of responsibility. I basically felt my mother's life is in my hands.
But after landing in the hospital's emergency room several times with dangerously high blood pressure, she realized the stress of caregiving was killing her.
I learned to push it down, push it down, push it down. And what I think happened finally after 14 years of this push it down, the blood pressure started to go up, and the anxiety got so that I couldn't control it anymore. I was taking a anti-anxiety medication every day to function, to keep it together.
That's when her doctor referred her to a psychiatrist who prescribed a special caregivers course at Massachusetts General Hospital. Here, doctors see firsthand how caregivers are affected by stress.
Insomnia, which I think is the number one. It could be anxiety, it could be depression, it could be hypertension, it could be irritable bowel syndrome.
To treat the symptoms, Dr. Ann Webster uses yoga, cognitive behavior therapy, and meditation.
People are too busy worrying about everything. They can't fall asleep, they can't stay asleep. And, they're popping too many pills.
Research shows that caregivers are more likely to have higher levels of stress hormones, weaker immune systems, which lead to more sick days, and higher levels of obesity. At the same time that EVELYN was caring for her parents, she was trying to raise a family and work. Were you resentful when you had to give up your job, career?
Yes. Yeah, it was difficult. And part of that, I just expected that once I raised 4 children, that I was going to have a chance to have my life. I tried being selfless for 15 years, and after a while it gets old. I always have a problem with the right side of that walker. I don't know why.
With her health deteriorating, EVELYN's doctor told her to find another place for her mother to live. She found an assisted living facility in her hometown. Her doctor also said to go back to doing things she enjoyed. Tell me about the therapeutic value of being able to work on quilts like this.
Working with my hands, doing things with my hands is very soothing to me.
Now she's off almost all of her medications, and her relationship with her mother is stronger than ever.
Now I don't have this anxiety, this guilt, because I know she's being cared for by, professional people. 24/7, I'm at peace.
Well, my first guest can relate to EVELYN's story. Ellen Goodman is a syndicated columnist who has written about caring for her elderly parents. Welcome, Ellen. Well, your story led to something much bigger, but just what happened with you and your parents?
I think that my story with my mother, like the story that you saw is part of the longevity revolution. 60 isn't just the new 50. 60 is the new caregiver of the 85-year-old. Yeah. We're dealing with a lot of this. We are not alone. As you said, for me, the hard part was really dealing with my mother as she deteriorated in her late 80s and 90s, and she was no longer able to decide what she wanted for lunch, let alone what she wanted for medical care. And I became her medical decision maker, and I was shocked at finding myself, I was pretty blindsided by the kind of decisions that I had to make. And it wasn't really until the end of her life when I realized I was not alone, and that there were so many of us who, particularly at the end of life, were trying to make medical decisions, and we had not had a conversation with our parents about how they wanted to live at the end of their lives. So we were often left guilty and uncertain about whether we had done the right thing.
So now you've started this thing literally called the Conversation Project, where you encourage people to start a conversation while your parents are still lucid. They still have their thinking faculties.
Yeah, it's always too soon until it's too late. We started the Conversation Project as a public engagement campaign to make it easier for people to have these conversations at the kitchen table, not in the ICU, with the people that they loved, so that they would know and be prepared for making decisions when the time came. And that's been, we have a conversation starter kit, which really helps people think about what matters to them. And it's not a scary medical one, but it talks about values and what's important to you as you
you say the conversation has to be not what's the matter, but what's matters. I'd like to also bring in Dr. Eric Weil, who helps oversee primary care at Mass General and encounters these situations every day. Is this become more and more common, Dr. Weil, the situation where people feel that they have to take the parents into their homes? They don't want to put them in assisted living, or part of it is a guilt situation. Part is, well, I've got the means, I've got the room, I can do it. Is it become more common?
Well, I don't know that it's become more common, but there are the population has aged, and so there are more people that are finding themselves in this type of situation on a year-by-year basis. And I think that people make decisions that aren't necessarily informed ones, and they make assumptions that caring for a loved one is easier perhaps than it actually is, both from an emotional point of view, a physical and a financial.
Do you actually give advice to people? I mean, are you part of
all the time. Most primary care physicians are well versed in having or facilitating these discussions, and it's not uncommon for patients to come into the office with their children, or quite frankly with their spouses who may be actually losing some of their own functions, to have just these conversations.
Well, that's the problem.
Except in fact, only 17% of people in Massachusetts have had these conversations with their doctors. And we did a survey with their doctors. We had a survey that said that 90% of people know it's important to have these conversations, and yet only 30% are having them, even with their families. So we're trying to close that gap.
Well, it's an uncomfortable conversation to have, and if you don't have a strong relationship with your primary care physician, sometimes that's not the place where you're comfortable starting it. Now, the goal is if you have a good and tight relationship, that's a person who can help facilitate, but it doesn't always work that way.
It can be important, but it's also true that families changed the way we give birth in America. It wasn't that the hospitals necessarily said, oh, please come in and, let's have the husband with a video camera and the baby in a bathtub. It was really families that said, this is not just a medical moment in life, it's a spiritual moment, it's a human moment. And so if we can have people having these conversations before there is a crisis at the kitchen table, it will make it all much easier for survivors, too. I
don't know if this was your case, too, but some of these things are so incremental. They sneak up on you, and before you know it, you're dealing with a parent with diminished capacity in terms of thinking straight and that kind of thing. You think, wait a minute, I haven't had that conversation yet, and then you realize you can't really get through to them in the way that you could have.
So often, by the time you have that by the time you actually think about having that conversation, it is a little bit too late. And so I think that's why the resources that you're putting together, that you're offering to people to actually go through a process of doing this, are really, really valuable.
And we make it pretty easy. It's not always, it doesn't have to be that hard, and it can be one of the most intimate conversations you've had in your life, not just a really hard medical one.
Yeah, and it's also because it involves finances and end-of-life issues and all those. All right, we're going to be continuing this series all week. Dr. Eric Weil, Ellen Goodman, Thanks so much for coming.
You.
Thank you.
All right, and as part of the series, we've collected information to help you choose the right care options. We've also drawn on our own experiences to share advice. Here's WGBH News' Linda Pollack, who shares her story of caring for her dad, who was a World War II veteran.
What we learned later in his life, late into his life, was that he qualified for benefits from the Veterans Administration. That meant that for the last few months of his life, we were able to get home health care free of charge to come in and look on him 3 or 4 days a week, which allowed him to stay in his apartment until he died just a month ago.
You can also see my advice to caregivers and get information about support services at WGBHnews.org.